Following Trump's aggressive tariff announcements last week, global stock markets have tumbled, and there's been turmoil in the currency market too, with the US dollar falling to a 6-month low against the euro last Thursday. However, on Monday morning, the Swiss franc strengthened to its highest level against the US dollar since October, with Goldman Sachs reportedly advising its clients to add it in a note. It comes as fears of US and global recessions rise, with Goldman Sachs having hiked the risk of a US recession from 35 to 45%, and JP Morgan raising its risk of a global recession to 60%. As such, investors are now looking for so-called safe haven assets, like the Swiss franc. So in this video, we'll take a look at the history of the Swiss franc, discuss why it's strengthening, and whether it could be the world's safest currency. We're getting remarkably close to 1 million subscribers, and currently 72% of you haven't yet subscribed. So lend us a hand and subscribe today. Let's start with a brief economic history of Switzerland. 2 centuries ago, Switzerland was a poor rural agricultural economy before it began to industrialize from the mid-19th century. At this point, Switzerland had hundreds of currencies originating from various German and French coins. In fact, as of 1820, some 8,000 distinct coins were being used in Switzerland. Then in 1850, as a result of the newly established 1848 Swiss Federal Constitution, the Swiss franc was introduced, as well as a series of political reforms transforming Switzerland from a fragmented confederation of cantons to a more centralized federal state. This removed barriers to Switzerland's movement of people, goods, and money, and also laid the foundations for Switzerland's famous neutrality principle, which underpins its foreign relations to this very day. Switzerland's banking sector also began to develop around this time, with Credit Suisse founded in 1856. Then in 1865, Switzerland, France, Belgium, and Italy formed the Latin Monetary Union, in which they agreed to value their national currencies to a common standard, which massively eased trade and the flow of goods between the 4 countries and reduced currency fluctuations. The union soon grew to include countries as far afield as Brazil and Argentina, before collapsing in the late 19th century due to the Long Depression, when the value of silver fell drastically. Switzerland's small domestic market also forced it to open up to international trade from the very start. In 1920, Swiss industries were already exporting enormous shares of their domestic production, including 98% of watches, 95% of silk, 90% of chemicals, and 80% of chocolate. After the end of World War II in 1945, Switzerland joined the Bretton Woods system, under which the US dollar became the center of a new international monetary order, and against which all other major currencies were pegged at fixed exchange rates. And the Swiss franc was pegged to the dollar until 1970, and during this period, Switzerland experienced rapid economic growth, helped by labour migration from Italy from the 1950s, with exports increasing exponentially, particularly of watches, pharmaceuticals, and chemicals, plus developments in the Swiss services sector. Switzerland also became a hub for international organisations and conventions, like the United Nations and World Health Organization, further boosting its global economic standing. Switzerland still has an incredibly internationally open economy today, with exports of goods and services accounting for more than 75% of Swiss GDP in 2023, according to World Bank data, of which about a quarter are Swiss financial services, like banking, insurance, and licensing. So now we've done a quick bit of history, let's look at the Swiss franc's growing strength today. Before it was pegged the dollar in 1945, the Swiss franc had another requirement that helped it develop its status as a so-called safe haven currency, i.e. a currency that's reliable and either holds or even strengthens its value in times of global economic uncertainty, which is exactly what we're seeing now, with the Swiss franc strengthening to a 6-month high against the dollar. And this was its link to gold. For context, between 1920 and 2000, the Swiss franc had a legal requirement that a minimum of 40% be backed by gold reserves. This meant that paper money could be exchanged for a set amount of gold, which was universally accepted, giving the Swiss franc stability and value in the international markets. The Swiss franc's link to gold lasted until it was terminated in a referendum on the 1st of May 2000, when it became a fiat currency, meaning that it's not directly tied to physical commodities like gold, but instead derives its values from Switzerland's economic strength and public trust in the government that issues it. So how did the Swiss franc become a safe haven currency, even though it's now decoupled from gold? Well, as we've mentioned, there are a few particularities about Switzerland that have earned the Swiss franc a reputation as a stable currency, including its political neutrality, which means that its currency is less at risk during geopolitical shocks, its independence from the EU, which protects it from negative political impacts, and its strong financial institutions, which are seen as fiscally prudent and reliable. Switzerland has also had historically low inflation rate, and in February, inflation fell to its lowest level in nearly 4 years, with investors typically viewing low inflation as a sign of long-term economic stability. So Switzerland's perceived economic stability makes the Swiss franc more attractive during times of global market turmoil, like we're seeing at the moment. Moreover, because of its historical requirement to store gold, the Swiss National Bank still has the 6th largest gold reserves in the world, with more than 1,000 metric tons according to the World Gold Council. And since gold is still considered a safe haven asset, this also adds to Switzerland's perception of economic stability, which in turn helps the franc. And on top of all of that, right now the Swiss franc is also benefiting from the shakiness of other previous safe haven currencies, namely the dollar. As we explained in a previous video, a month before Trump's tariff blitz had even been announced, the dollar was already slipping due to the growing risk of a US recession. This week, with that risk even more acute, it fell again while Trump refused to walk back his tariffs or implement any kind of delay. Now, things have obviously changed since then, but while the dollar tumbled, the Swiss franc was surging. And a similar phenomenon is also happening with the Japanese yen, which Trump seemingly revived from its 2024 collapse. So looking ahead, will the Swiss franc continue to strengthen? Well, of course, a lot of it depends on what happens with Trump's tariffs. But as of the time of writing, it doesn't look good for the dollar, with investors increasingly worried about the prospect of a US recession, even despite Trump's recent rollbacks. With the US and China increasingly locking horns, with both sides threatening higher and higher tariffs on each other, experts are increasingly concerned about the rate of escalation. If a global recession does occur, it would create losers everywhere. But the former US ambassador to Switzerland, Edward McCullen, has claimed that Switzerland will be in a very good position, even despite the 31% tariff that Trump put on Swiss goods. So it could be that the strength of the Swiss franc helps the country muddle through a trade war relatively unscathed. And this story, like much of the news, is worth paying attention to in the weeks ahead, because with geopolitics in flux and Trump throwing the international order up in the air, there's a lot to keep an eye on. Every day we're faced with weird headlines, from Musk declaring anyone who looks at him the wrong way a terrorist, to Trump declaring war on Jupiter to try and regain some extraterrestrial allies. Okay, that second one wasn't real, but we do dive into the weird world of US politics in our series WTF USA. That's our show where we take big moments from culture and social media and try and explain the political implications of, say, Musk running around trying to put out Tesla fires. And unlike some of our other serious videos, the tone of WTF USA is more lighthearted and takes something of an irreverent look at what's going on. And if you're interested, WTF USA can be found exclusively on Nebula. Nebula is also home to some other incredible original content from your favourite creators, like Tom Nicholas's Boomers, discussing everything from generational inequality, housing, the climate crisis, and pensions. The globetrotting feature-length documentary tries to unpack the questionable legacy of the baby boomers. If you didn't know, Nebula is an independent, creator-owned streaming platform that specializes in thoughtful content from creators like Real Life Law, Wendover Productions, Legal, and Neo. And when it comes to us, it's not just WTF USA either. You can also watch every normal TLDR video on Nebula ad-free, and in some instances, before they even land on YouTube. If you're not a member already, you can click our link in the description to get 40% off. That's just $36 a year, or $3 a month. So take the news a little less seriously, and check out WTF, only on Nebula.